Hello everyone, welcome back to ISC Psychology. Today we will look at part 2 in schools of thought. In the last video, we covered structuralism, functionalism, and behaviorism. If you haven't watched that one yet, I would suggest starting there because this video picks up right where we left off. I have put a link in the description box for the previous video. Today, we are covering the remaining two schools, Psychoanalysis and Gestalt psychology. For your exams, pay attention to the names of the psychologists with their key concepts. A quick recap. In the last video, we looked at how different schools of thought had different answers to the question, what should psychology study and how? Structuralism said, study the structure of the mind and break it into elements. Functionalism said, study the function of the mental processes, how they help us adapt. Behaviorism said, study only observable behavior. Let's start today with psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is associated almost entirely with one name, Sigmund Freud. And Freud is one of those figures who is almost impossible to overstate the influence of. Whether or not you agree with his ideas, the way ordinary people talk about the mind today is shaped by Freud. The idea that we have an unconscious, that childhood experiences shape adult personality, that we use defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from uncomfortable feelings. All of that comes from Freud. Freud was an Austrian neurologist working in Vienna in the late 1800s. He started out treating patients with nervous disorders, things like paralysis or anxiety that had no clear physical cause. And through his clinical work, he became convinced that these symptoms had psychological roots, specifically roots in experiences and conflicts that the person was not consciously aware of. And that insight became the foundation for psychoanalysis. The central idea in psychoanalysis is the unconscious. According to Freud, much of our behavior is driven by unconscious thoughts, desires, and conflicts, which are not directly accessible and often rooted in childhood experiences. So, behavior is not always rational or conscious. Freud argued that the human mind is like an iceberg, an important metaphor that you need to pay attention to. The tip of the iceberg above water is the conscious mind, everything you are currently aware of. Your thoughts right now, what you can see and hear. That's only a small part. Just below the surface is the preconscious, things you are not thinking about right now but could easily bring to mind. Your home address, what you had for breakfast, and so on. And then, there's the vast mass beneath the water, the unconscious. This is where Freud believed the most powerful material lives. Memories, desires, fears, conflicts that are too painful or threatening to become consciously acknowledged, or so the mind pushes them down. Another important contribution of Freud was his theory on the structure of personality. He devised a three-part structure of personality, the id, ego, and superego, which we will cover in detail in class 12. But for now, remember that the id operates on the pleasure principle, which deals with instincts and desires. The ego operates on the reality principle and balances demands, while the superego balances between right and wrong and operates on moral values. Freud believed that behavior is the result of conflict between these three. Freud's methods for studying the mind were also revolutionary. Two of these were free association and dream analysis. These were techniques used to access the unconscious, asking patients to say whatever came to mind without censoring themselves, and interpreting the content of their dreams as disguised expressions of unconscious wishes. In free association, the person is asked to say whatever comes to mind without filtering their thoughts. For example, if a psychologist says mother, the person may respond with words like care, childhood, strict, fear, or lonely. These responses may seem random, but they can reveal hidden emotions or unconscious conflicts. In dream analysis, Freud believed that dreams reveal unconscious thoughts and desires. For example, dreaming about running away from something may reflect hidden anxiety or avoidance of a real-life problem. The dream that we see is called manifest content, and its hidden meaning is called latent content. Now, for your exam, Freud is one of the two psychologists you need to know for psychoanalysis, and these are some of the key concepts that you need to remember. 1. The unconscious mind and its role in behavior. 2. The structure of personality, id, ego, and superego. Lastly, the method Freud used, which was dream analysis and free association. Both of these techniques were used to access the unconscious. The second psychologist you need to know for psychoanalysis is Carl Jung. Jung was originally a collaborator of Freud's, almost like a chosen successor, but the two eventually had a famous falling out over theoretical differences. And those differences are important here because a lot of students get confused. Jung agreed with Freud that the unconscious was central to understanding the mind, but he extended the idea significantly. Freud's unconscious was essentially personal, made up of your own repressed memories and desires. Jung proposed that beyond the personal conscious, there is a collective unconscious. This idea of the collective unconscious is what makes Jung distinct from Freud and is a concept you will need to remember for your exams. The second concept associated with Jung that sometimes appears in exam questions is his distinction between introversion and extroversion. Jung actually coined these terms. Introverts are energized by their inner world, extroverts by the external world. These words are now so common that it's easy to forget Jung invented them. The collective unconscious is a layer of the unconscious that is shared across all human beings, regardless of culture, time period, or individual experience. It contains what Jung called archetypes, universal symbolic figures and patterns that appear across all human cultures, like the hero, the mother, the shadow, and the wise old man. Jung noticed that these figures appeared in myths, religions, fairy tales, and dreams across completely unconnected cultures, and he argued that this could not be a coincidence. It must reflect something deeply shared in the human psyche. Let us now look at some of Jung's universal archetypes with examples which will help you understand better. First, the hero. The hero represents courage, strength, and the desire to overcome challenges. The hero typically faces difficulties, fights against evil or obstacles, and achieves victory or growth. Characters like superheroes, warriors, or even a student overcoming failure reflect the hero archetype. Next, the shadow. The shadow represents the darker, hidden side of personality. It includes things like fear, aggression, or repressed desires, traits we do not accept in ourselves. For example, a person who appears calm but has hidden anger or jealousy is showing aspects of the shadow. In stories, villains often represent the shadow. Next, the mother archetype. This represents care, protection, and nurturing. It is associated with love, safety, and support. For instance, a caring parent, a teacher, or even symbolic figures like Mother Earth reflect the mother archetype. Lastly, the wise old man represents wisdom and knowledge. This archetype appears as a figure who gives advice or helps others make decisions. This is something like a mentor or a teacher or an elder who guides someone, like a guide in stories, represents the old man archetype. For your exam, Freud and Jung are your two psychologists. Make sure you write their concepts next to their names, not just the name. One other important thing. Do not include Freud's theory of personality and developmental stages here, as it is a Class 12 topic. For his school of thought, answer, keep it to the above concepts: unconscious, structure of personality at a surface level, and his method. Now we move to Gestalt psychology, and this is one of the most intuitive schools to understand because Gestalt ideas explain things about perception that you have all probably experienced your entire life without ever having a name for. The word Gestalt is German and roughly translates to form or whole shape. And the core principle is this: the mind does not perceive the world by adding up individual parts. It perceives wholes, patterns, or organized forms, and the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. Let us look at a simple example. When you look at a face, you don't consciously process each figure separately: a nose here, two eyes there, a mouth below. You see the entire face instantly as a whole. That is the Gestalt process. This was a direct challenge to structuralism, which believed that the mind works by breaking things down into elements. The Gestalt psychologists said no, that is not how perception works at all. You cannot understand the mind by atomizing it. The founder of Gestalt psychology is Max Wertheimer, a German psychologist working in the early 1900s. Wertheimer's most famous contribution came from a very simple observation, the phi phenomenon. Wertheimer noticed that when two stationary lights flash in quick succession, we perceive them as a single light moving between 2 points, even though nothing is actually moving. You have seen this your whole life in a cinema or in animated patterns. The movement is not real, but your mind is creating it by perceiving it a whole pattern rather than two separate flashes. This concept fascinated Wertheimer because it proved that perception is not simply a passive recording of what is going on out there. The mind is actively organizing sensory information. It is filling gaps, it is creating movement where there is none, and it is imposing meaning and pattern. The experience, for instance, the moving light, is something that the mind constructs, and it does not exist in the individual stimuli themselves. From Wertheimer's work came the famous laws of organization, or laws of grouping, which describe the principles the mind uses to actively organize perception. You will cover these in detail in the Attention and Perception chapter, but let us name them here so you recognize them when they appear. They are similarity, proximity, continuity, simplicity, and closure. The second Gestalt psychologist you need to know is Wolfgang Kohler. While Wertheimer focused on perception, Kohler applied Gestalt thinking to problem solving and learning, and his most famous work was done with chimpanzees. This was a very interesting study, so let us look at it a little more closely. Kohler's most celebrated experiment involved a chimpanzee named Sultan. Sultan was placed in a cage with bananas hanging out of reach. Nearby, there were several sticks, but none of them were long enough to reach the bananas individually. After a period of apparently doing nothing, just sitting and looking at the problem, Sultan suddenly picked up the two sticks, fitted them together to make a longer stick, and then used it to retrieve the bananas. What Kohler found remarkable was that the solution wasn't arrived at through trial and error. The behaviorist explanation would have been that Sultan tried random behaviors until one worked. Instead, Sultan seemed to understand the problem and arrive at the solution in a flash. Kohler called this insight learning, a sudden reorganization of perception that leads to the solution. You know the feeling yourself. You're stuck on a problem, you step away, and then suddenly the answer is just there, complete. That is insight. And Kohler argued that behaviorism, with its focus on stimulus response and trial and error, could never explain this kind of learning. This will come up again in your learning chapter. Kohler's insight learning sits alongside Pavlov's classical conditioning and Skinner's operant conditioning as one of the key learning theories. For your exam, Wertheimer and Kohler are your two psychologists. Wertheimer with his phi phenomenon, laws of organization, and perception as an active construct. Kohler with his Sultan experiment, insight learning, and problem solving as a sudden reorganization. Remember, the key phrase for Gestalt is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you have that phrase in your answer, you've got the essence of that school. Now that we've covered all 5 schools across both the videos, let us put them together so you can see the whole landscape. This is the kind of overview that helps you enormously in exams if asked to compare or contrast. Structuralism focuses on the structure of the mind, method, introspection. Psychologists Wundt and Titchener. Functionalism focuses on the function of mental processes and adaptation. Psychologists James and Dewey. Behaviorism focuses on observable behavior only. Psychologists Watson and Skinner. Psychoanalysis focuses on the unconscious mind. Psychologists Freud and Jung. Gestalt focuses on perception of wholes, not parts. Psychologists Wertheimer and Kohler. When you put all 5 schools together, you can see a kind of argument running through them. Each school was in some way a response to the limitations of what came before. That is the narrative thread, and if you remember that thread, you will never mix them up. Now, a few key things to keep in mind for your exams. The syllabus says 2 psychologists per school with their relevant concepts. That means 10 psychologists in total across 5 schools. Second, the most common mixing up I see is students writing Kohler under behaviorism because his Sultan experiment sounds like a learning experiment. Remember, Kohler was Gestalt. Thirdly, if you're asked to write about any one school in a longer answer, say for a 5 or 6 mark answer, the structure should be this. Start by defining the school, state the core principle, name both psychologists with their concepts, and briefly state why the school was significant or how it differed from the others. That structure gives you all the marks. And finally, the ISC paper sometimes asks short questions like, name the school of thought associated with the study of the unconscious mind. The answer is psychoanalysis. Or, which school emphasized that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? Gestalt. These are easy marks if you know the phrases. That wraps up schools of thought. Both the videos combined give you everything the syllabus asks for on this topic. The next video will examine different schools of psychology and its relationship with other subjects and disciplines. If you have any questions about this video or the previous one, drop them in the comments. See you in the next one, and follow ACE ISC Psychology for more such content.